Oi oi, it's your boy, the not wasting a good pun on this card, Jack Slack. It's the Jack Slack podcast, and we're coming at you following UFC, Rena Derida versus Brendan Allen. What a mess this card was. Lots of finishes on the prelims. Started a good streak. Couple of interesting performances, but oh my god, did the main card not deliver. Mainly hinging around the Zahabi, Marlon Vera non-fight and the Malot, Kevin Holland sort of fight, with an undercurrent of absolutely dreadful reffing throughout the night. The usual officials, particularly Dan Mergliata, really on one for this card. I'm going to bang through this in about 10 minutes, I reckon, so I'm not going to bury the lead. Let's talk about Brendan Allen versus Rena Derida. Brendan Allen kind of did what he did to Paul Craig, to be honest. He is a good enough grappler that he can stay safe on top, turn over some nice elbows, and rough people up. But then when he meets people he can't get on top of, he's well-rounded enough that he goes, it's all right, I'll win this from the bottom. And he either rolls into a leg entanglement like he did against Fluffy in their first fight, or he shoots a bad takedown and then pulls into half guard off the sprawl like he did against Dimavov. And he's not good enough to win fights from the bottom. There are very few people who are. If you meet another fighter of nearly your level or about the same level and you end up on the bottom, you're probably going to have a rough time of it. And that seems to be what he's showing up against people like Rena Derida. Rena Derida ended up on the bottom against him, started trying to throw up arm bars and so on, and Brendan Allen kept his... They used to call it the can opener, but the can opener implies one particular guard opening or guard break. When you're in someone's closed guard and you want to open their legs, you put both hands behind their head, double collar tie, you reach up nice and high on the crown of their head, and you crumple them like a ball into their own sternum. And it's a neck crank and it forces them to open their legs. And some people have been submitted by that neck crank, but I think that overshadows the usefulness of the position of having both hands behind the opponent's head. Because if he wants to do anything, he has to walk his hips out away from you. And if you've got both hands behind his head, you can just pull his hips in. You can always turn over the elbow and you'll know where their head is because you'll have one hand on their head. So you just have to elbow to your hand. And if they do swing their hips out for an armbar, like Derida was doing the sort of armbar that Diego Lopez often throws up, where he really throws his hips out to the side and he leans his head in towards one of your knees. And if they do that, you don't have to pull them into the center of their chest anymore. You just pull their head into their knee. And you can start elbowing them while they're stuck in that position. Because if you've got your elbows in nice and tight, very hard for them to actually accomplish an armbar on you in that way. Now, it requires a good deal of sensitivity and strength, and it's not that easy. But if you watch someone like Georges St. Pierre, he had magnificent success from this position. Greg Jackson calls it goalposts, when you got both forearms down their collarbones and your hands behind their head. John Jones also did some terrific work with this early in his UFC run. But yeah, Derida got beat up in that position a lot. I mean, the start of this fight, Derida looked pretty good. He was picking up singles and finishing them on Allen, who's got okay wrestling. He was pushed to the fence, and he immediately, with the overhook, hit a haragoshi or some kind of judo throw, almost straight into mount, which is the thing we're always saying now. If your back's on the fence, you've got to attack with throws. You've got to be trying to take the guy down rather than purely defending yourself. Derida got on the back a few times. You saw Brendan Allen using sort of like tripoding escapes and the ones where, and turning back into escapes, the ones that work really well with no gi on and work really well with gloves on because the guy is going to have such a hard time choking you. And one of the themes we're always talking about on this podcast is like, if you are on someone's back and you're both looking up at the ceiling, you have no real strikes except maybe a heel strike that no one uses. It's going to be very hard to choke them once you've established the position because they know that's the only thing you've got. And then if they ever turn back into you, you're on the bottom. And I think in the first two rounds, most instances of Brendan Allen getting on top were him escaping from bad positions. It was only in the later fight that he came out and started trying to double leg Derida, or successfully double legged Derida. You did get to see Derida throw up that reverse triangle that I talked about last time we were examining him. I thought about doing a little video on this actually because him and Charles Johnson is the other one who does this quite a lot. To do it, you have to sort of convince the guy that he's past your guard or passing your guard, and then you catch him in between. So the guy who invented it, or at least made it popular from the bottom, is Braulio Estima. And in ADCC, which is the big no-gi world championships, happens every 2 years. I think it was 2009, maybe 2007. He rocked up and he caught 2 people with this just by sort of letting them half pass his guard and then kicking through on this reverse triangle. And the other way you can get it is off the way that Charles Johnson ends up in it quite a few times is off caught front kicks. He'll get his front kick caught, and as they come in, he'll fall to his back so that they're on top of his knee and his other leg is over across their head, and then he'll kick through on this reverse triangle. It's a really strong position. It's a really strong choke if you can get your way all the way through, and it's a really good one for people who are lanky within their weight class. But I think that happened at the end of round 3, and in the process of squeezing his arse off for that, Derida seemed to spend anything he had left because he had a hard time getting to his corner then, and then in round 4, they had to peel him off the canvas at the end of the round. I think this is a complicated one because I don't enjoy watching Brendan Allen fight much. I think he's a very flawed fighter, but I do think this was a good performance for him, and I do want to give him credit for it. But I do also want to mention, like, Rena Derida, yes, he's got all these flaws and things that we've previously mentioned, but also this is his 4th fight of the year, and very, very, very few people do that. I think Donald Cerrone, who was like famous for taking loads and loads of fights, did it twice. It used to be a Dana Whiteism that you'd say like, oh, Fedor couldn't hang in the UFC because this is where the best fight the best 3 times a year. And there was some truth to that because Fedor did fight a lot of like plumbers. But then you looked at the stats and it just wasn't true. I think it came up this week to do with someone who was having their 5th fight of the year. The number of guys who fought 4 times a year in the UFC is like 10 total. And the number of guys who fought 3 times in a year is like, it's pretty rare to go through a year without not like a catastrophic injury, but a significant injury that knocks off your schedule and prevents you from getting 3 fights in. Plus, there's the lining up of them offering you a fight and you accepting the fight. And there's a million reasons to turn down a fight that aren't just being scared of the opponent. If they offer you a fight in Australia or the UK and you want that lovely Las Vegas not getting taxed status on your winnings, you're going to say no and wait. But Derida, 4 times this year, he has brought himself down to make weight and then put weight back on again for the fight. 4 times this year, he's peaked for a fight. It's an awful lot to ask of the body. Peaking in combat sports is also quite an interesting topic generally, because you do want breaks from the hard sparring, you do want breaks from the really hard work, and when you're on a schedule like this, the recovery time is just not there. Plus, weight cutting generally, which is one of the things that in combat sports we have, and in any other sport they go, so wait, what? You play the game, you play the match a day after you've just spent a whole week dehydrating down. And you go, yeah, actually, when you put it that way, it sounds really stupid. Tony Ferguson doing a double weight cut to prove a point is a great example of that. And that was basically the start of the end of his career. He'd been sort of slowing down, but the drop-off was just incredible, and people can go back and say it's when he did the double weight cut. So yeah, not to excuse Derida's performance, I think it is kind of unfair to I don't like labeling fighters as quitters, just generally in this sport, because one of the things about MMA, and I remember this was a stupid thing with MMA and boxing ages ago, where they were like, boxers don't quit, MMA fighters do, blah, 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 boxing is illegal to quit or whatever. It's like, no, well, Roberto Duran, one of the greatest boxers of all time, very famously quit in the middle of a fight, and then had an amazing Hall of Fame career after that. And he quit from frustration, which is even more unusual. But I just constantly remember that Charles Oliveira was for a long time considered a front runner and a quitter and a guy who folded if he got hurt. And now nothing could be further from the truth. He's remembered for being like, gets dropped in every fight, comes back fighting with the heart of a lion. But I do think we need more pressure on corners to do the quitting, because it was Derrida's cornerman who was saying, like, are you okay to fight? I don't think you're okay to fight, blah, blah, blah. And, we're going to talk about this with Kevin Holland. You're not going to get the fighter to say, like, no, I don't want to continue very easily. At some point, you've got to, someone has to be like, well, is it worth him getting beaten up for another however many rounds? Is it worth him fighting with a possibly ruptured testicle for another 15 minutes? And then Brendan Allen's interview after this was hilarious, because he came out and said, they said, like, a lot of people will say that you've just lost to Imavov and Fluffy Hernandez. Where do you think you stack up in the title picture? And he said, I think you can make a good case that I won both of those fights. It's like, oh, okay, right. Forget any idea that he's grown as a fighter or improved, because he thinks he won those fucking fights. And neither of those fights was he. I mean, they were 3-round fights, so you can say like he maybe edged one round, which makes it feel like he was close to winning. But both those guys were just levels above him. And then even funnier, he said, everyone I've fought has been at their best when I've met them. And then he goes, Marvin Vettori, that was the best Vettori we've seen in a long time. It's like, no, Marvin Vettori looks awful and looks worse every fight. Didn't he drop Vettori, who's got like a famously iron chin? That's how washed Vettori is. Anyway, co-main was Mike Malot versus Kevin Holland. This is kind of sad because Mike Malot, I thought he'd have horrible trouble with Kevin Holland because of the height difference and the reach. And just being a pretty generic 1-2-3 banger. But I thought he showed out well, but this fight is going to be forever asterisked by the fact that he hit Kevin Holland in the balls. Was it twice or thrice? But they were pretty bad. Kevin Holland took the full 5 minutes. And now this is like, there are things you can blame Kevin Holland for and other stuff. Like he took more than the full 5 minutes. He then was turning away and trying to get more breaks within the fight. And then at the end of the round, he didn't come out for another minute. They had the doctor come in and examine him, so he gets another break. But all of that's the ref's fault. You know, Kevin Holland's not going to say, no, actually, I'm not going to continue. Unless he feels like his ball's dropped off. Which, you know, you hope if you feel that bad, you'd be like, okay, maybe I've got testicular torsion. Not going to risk my ball. But Malot did some good work. I quite liked what he did when he had Holland against the fence in a couple of instances where he would move in and he'd just throw those half-assed pity-patter straights, 3 or 4, against Kevin Holland's high guard, and then he'd dig a body shot, and then he came with a knee afterwards as Kevin Holland ducked. So he's doing some nice stuff with that. His inside slip to left hook counter was nice, but through it all, it looked like Kevin Holland was in significant pain long after getting kicked in the groin. And I saw the knee, and it did look like a lot of it hit on the hip, but it looked like maybe the top of his shin came into the side of the cup. And I try not to judge these too harshly because I remember that, it only took one for for Czech Congo to knock Mirko Krokop's ball back up into his pelvis in a way that it had to be surgically retrieved. And at the time we were going like, oh, come on, Mirko, walk it off. You know, he's cheating a bit, but come on, you got to get your head back in the game. And it's like, well, no, I think he can probably feel if he's lost a ball, So yeah, I'll be refreshing the Twitter feed, looking for updates on Kevin Holland's ball situation. Mike Malot did decently. Well, he did well, but it was a fight that was completely tainted from about a minute and a half in. Ayman Zahabi versus Marlon Vera was a Marlon Vera fight. Fucking awful. This guy, I mean, I remember being a big fan of him going into the Song Yudong fight and going like, he could have won that. He just didn't do enough. And I didn't know that would be the theme of the next 12 fights. Even in his 4 wins on the trot in 2021 and 2022, beat Davy Grant in a decision that a lot of people didn't like because it's Davy Grant and he loses close decisions. Beat the ghost of Frankie Edgar and still barely did enough in that fight until he knocked him out. Beat Rob Font by being out-volumed in every round and then landing a couple of big punches that got him 10-8 rounds. And then beat Dominic Cruz by, again, not doing enough and then finally head-kicking him in round 4. He's really low output, even in his best performances. And his last 5, he's just been dreadful. And I think that we all look at this, including me, and we say, but it's just a mental thing. If he turns it on, he's not washed. If he just did more of what he does, because when he does do something, it tends to have an effect. He landed a good intercepting jab against Zahabi that dropped him, and then followed up with a nice little combination into a body shot, and then the pressure came off and he just stopped doing anything else. But he fights like an older man going to the 5-er side, and then putting a burst of activity into 10 seconds and going, ha, still got it, and then not doing anything else for the rest of the time. He used to run ultra marathons and shit at the weekend. He used to run 9 miles a day to have the cardio, and then he fought like he was terrified of gassing. And now apparently he's not doing that. He's running sprints, and he's been working at a higher rate in the training room and stuff. And then you you come into the fight and it's just the same old Marlon Vera. So I'm happy to say, like, this guy is cooked now, because even if it's just a mental thing, it's such a mental thing that he cannot get past it. He's tried multiple things. They go back every time, and Jason Perillo has to go, you need to throw your hands. You need to do some work. You need to do something. And he goes, yeah, okay. And then goes out and doesn't do anything. And then does, like, fucking taunt emotes while cruising to a decision loss. Zahabi did a couple of cool things. I do like that long left hook he throws, particularly when Cheetah was southpaw. I love that he works into body shots. I love that he was using knees to the body in this fight, not being scared of getting taken down. But he is 37 years old. He's not really a prospect anymore. And he's, his last 2 wins have been over old men who don't do enough. Actually, Pedro Munoz is an old man who doesn't do enough. So last 3 wins. Manon Fiorot knocked out Jasmine Jesuda Vicious. Jesuda Vicious complained about the stoppage. I thought it was fine. Landed a left hand across the top, coming out of like a little scrappy exchange. Followed up with punches and knees and got the stoppage. Is anyone excited about Manon Fiorot? She lost a 3-2 decision to Valentina Shevchenko. And if any other dominant champion, like if Merab won a 3-2 decision, you'd go, that's a close competitive fight. We should get them back out there again. But people don't care about Valentina fights. They're just like, yeah, put it on the scoreboard. Do the dance. That's what we're here for. Oh, Charles Jourdain versus Davy Grant. Both my boys, but Davy Grant more my boy. Very impressive from Charles Jourdain because he's quite late in the day in his career. I mean, he's only like 29, I think. Yeah, 29. But he's been around forever. He's very shot-worn. But to finish Davy Grant is like unheard of. He suffered a couple of submission losses earlier in his like UFC career because he came in through the Ultimate Fighter. But in recent years, since like, when was the last time he submitted? 2018. So like, been a while since he's been submitted. Never been knocked out. Barely even gets hurt. He's just a hard out for anyone. Hard day at the office. And what I really liked in this one was that Charles Jourdain was looking for these jumping knees. He landed 2. And the second one knocked Davy on his arse. And he was basically, like, he looked like he was fighting on autopilot from then because he just came up into the guillotine. And it's like, that's Charles Jourdain's best move. They would have been working all camp on not jumping headfirst into a guillotine, but he was just out of it. But that jumping knee is a great shout against a guy who likes to throw the right hand to the body. The danger of the right hand to the body is that you can be hit from underneath while ducking down to it. The way that Davy fights, he often takes a punch and then comes back with the jab and loading up his right hand behind him and throwing the right hand to the body. And if you watch that second one, he's like ducking down straight into the knee. Blows his face wide open. He was a bloody mess after the stoppage. But great stuff, I thought, from Charles Jourdain. A bright spot on this card. Carl Nelson versus Matt Frivola, another case of just atrocious reffing because Carl Nelson basically stopped Frivola. I believe Dan Mergliata called the round with like 2 seconds to go. Nelson thought he'd won. Frivola thought he'd lost. They both ended up back in their corners. Massive adrenaline dump for Nelson. The second and third round, Frivola actually did a great job coming back, to be basically knocked out. And then fight competitively for 2 rounds is impressive. But equally, I've seen this happen a few times in MMA now. Guys thinking they get the stoppage. And then, of course, naturally, you're just going to be elated. There's going to be a huge relief. You're going to be like, right, now I can go home and pay my bills and things. You're looking for your wife in the crowd. You're looking for Dana to beg him for $50,000. Your brain has completely left the fight. And then they turn you around and go, hold on, that wasn't the end, actually. So another one, like Carl Nelson had gassed himself out trying to finish Matt Frivola, and Dan Mergliata had made it clear that he wasn't stopping the fight. That fight probably goes differently, but because of the weird stoppage and the adrenaline dump and continuing like that, again, another fight with a giant asterisk over it. Luckily, Kyle Nelson won, but he was robbed of his TKO there. Drew Dober versus Karl Prepolek was a fun fight, actually. Prepolek was doing good work with his right hook. There's 2 southpaws against each other. Dober was doing good work with his left hand, high on the head. I was watching this going, do you know who'd have loved that particular style that Drew Dober's showing? Zab Judah. Zab Judah, as a southpaw, made a specialty of the southpaw shoulder roll into left counter uppercut. And Dober's throwing this long southpaw left hand and like trying to weave after every single one. If Prepelec had been able to turn, even with a high guard with his right hand, just turn and come back with the counter uppercut, I think he'd have done some real damage there. But he was doing well on his own anyway. Another unfortunate thing where Derida kicked him in the junk a couple of times, I think, in the earlier fight, but then kicked him in the junk in the third round. Long break. I think they took a point, or did they not? I can't remember. But basically, Derida runs out and finishes Kyle Prepelec after he's had his time to recover. It's just so annoying when stuff like that happens, you know? I always think of Gabriel Gonzaga versus Chris Tuchscherer. Tuchscherer was one of Brock Lesnar's teammates. He was a wrestler, and he was pretty decent. But Gabriel Gonzaga was a 300-pound man-mountain, and he could high kick pretty well. He knocked out Krokop by surprise with a high kick. And he wallops Chris Tuchscherer with a low kick straight in the cup. Chris Tuchscherer's like almost vomiting in the cage. And then they go, come on, time's up. You've got to decide whether you want to fight. And he, like, almost in tears is like, yeah, I want to fight. And Gabriel Gonzaga just comes out and looks low and kicks him in the head. It's just absolutely brutal. Like, that man's lost half his paycheck for this. At that point, just stay down and try and get the DQ. But it's MMA. You're allowed to foul. That's, you know, because the refs aren't going to do shit most of the time. Aoriqileng knocked out Cody Gibson in. I saw the result of this before I watched the fight, and I knew what it was going to be. I was literally going through all the finishes inside 1 minute last year in the UFC, earlier last week, to make a little video on the thing that I'm always talking about. The number one way to get knocked out in MMA, quickly, is to come out and throw a hard kick. Where normally a low kick, but sometimes a body kick if it's a southpaw versus an orthodox. But you come out and you go, I don't need a feeling out period, thanks. I think he's stepping back. And you step in to throw your kick, and he at the same time has gone, maybe I'll pump a 1-2. You just, boom, collide with him. We're going to talk about this with usually Belgari, but kicking is for when they're backing up or standing still. And you only know they're doing that if you give them a little feel out first. Actually, let's talk about Belgari versus Bekoev. This fight, my number one thing, if Bekoev wanted to do this same fight again and win, throw some goddamn low kicks. Because he threw, I checked the stats, I didn't see him throw any. The stats say he threw and landed 2. But if you're fighting a kickboxer and you're a wrestler, we're going to talk about this with Jack Dedler Madalena versus Islam Makhachev in a couple of weeks. The wrestler's privilege is that he owns the kicking. Doesn't matter if your kicks are shit and the other guy's got great kicks. You are comfortable if he grabs your leg. He's not comfortable if you grab his leg. So you watch tons of fights between great kickboxers and great wrestlers or grapplers where the kickboxer doesn't use any of their kicks and you're going, why? Why is he not using his kicks? Think of Charles Oliveira versus Islam Makhachev. So much of Charles Oliveira's game relies on his front kicks to the body and him using knees in the clinch and wearing people out. And he didn't throw any against Makhachev because he was worried about the takedown. Yet Bekoev is fighting Belgari, and Belgari's throwing low kicks backing up, which is like, it can work. You can like slide back, low kick, slide back, but you've got to get, like, it's got to be really obvious what the other guy's doing. You've got to get his timing. You've got to read him pretty well, and you shouldn't be allowed to do it without being run onto the cage afterwards, because you still have to put your foot down behind you after you've been backing up and kicking. But more than that, when you are the wrestler against a kickboxer, if you throw low kicks, this used to be a thing all the time. People would go, you can't low kick with a great low kicker. And I'd go, yes, you can. It's not the same skill, checking low kicks and delivering low kicks. But if you throw low kicks at a good kickboxer, even if your low kicks are shit, they either take the low kick and get knocked off balance. They have to stand and brace to take the low kick, which means you can come in with the overhand afterwards. You can drop on their hips. You can do whatever. Or they pick their leg up and they stand on one leg for you. And you can come through with the overhand, or you can change onto their legs, or you can take a clinch or whatever. You are, so much of striking, good defensive striking, is distance management, and that's all done with your feet. If you can decide when the opponent's feet aren't allowed to work, it's a free pass to start dictating when they hit the fence, when you're going to start attempting your takedowns. And Azamat Bekoev was just lunging after him with overhands, doing nothing of note. Belgari looked good, I'm not going to lie, but he should have been, like, jabs cross his knees, the odd uppercut, that's all great. He's low kicking on the back foot. Shouldn't be allowing him to do that. And you're not throwing any low kicks at him. So he's just able to circle off every time you hit the fence. Because that's the other thing. When you hit the fence and level your feet out to start circling, that's when the back leg is always there to be kicked and do some damage. Slow the guy down. But Bekaev fought this fight very meat-headedly, I thought. Or he just doesn't know much about low kicks. Which is entirely possible because he's a big knockout artist, but he's a puncher and a wrestler mainly. Bruno Silva versus Hyun Sung Park. Did Bruno Silva really beat UFC headliner Hyun Sung Park? If you remember that, Park headlined in his last fight because basically the card fell apart and they were like, we need someone to fight Tatsuro Tairo, which is already a weak main event. And they're like, come on, lad, 10-0 lad from the undercard. Get up here. You look a bit like Kowluno, that's enough. But Tairo styled on him. And then Bruno Silva pretty much styled on him too. Bruno Silva, if you watch him against Joshua Van, when Joshua Van puts him under pressure, absolutely lost when he's backing up. And then he keeps throwing this overhand where he tries to run out the side door, like over him when he was scared of getting hit. And it just opens him up to worse counters. It's really like not good. But when Bruno Silva's allowed to work, he's pretty creative and fun. He's one of those guys who's got like lots of cool ideas and terrible fundamentals, generally. Or at least mid fundamentals. He's throwing that long uppercut as a lead. And then the thing about leading with the rear hand uppercut is if you weave after it or you step out the side door, it can work pretty well if you drop into the clinch or whatever. He's just doing it and then standing there. And I'm like, please throw back the left hook. But Park was, I think he got hurt pretty early on and didn't recover because he was just lumbering after Silva after a while. What I did like from Silva, he was using this jab with his palm, which is something that real rare name to bring up here. Ryan Jimmo used to do. He was like this big, I think he was a light heavyweight. Did he go to middleweight at one point? But he's a big dude with like a point karate / wrestling style. And it was not super fan friendly. But what he'd do is he'd intercept people with the jab, but he'd palm them in the forehead. And then he'd try and catch them with the right hand to where his hand just was. It's like if you're feeling where the guy is and you just want to chin him, that works really well. And you won't break your hand on a bad connection. But Silva was doing it in the way where he would palm the forehead and then rake his hand down the face. Like, I see what you're doing there, Bruno Silva. I also see your enormous back knee, the sudden development of knockout power, and all the headbutts you were landing as well. He's my boy now. You need to have a couple of heels you like. Oh, speaking of headbutts, I quite like what Marlon Vera was doing with the jab, come in with the high guard and try an elbow, and then jab, come in with your head and headbutt. I was talking about that the other week. I was saying like a good Muay Thai basic that you don't see enough in MMA is jab, lead elbow, and jab, cross, rear elbow. 2 ways of just getting the guy covering and then slicing him with an elbow, punishing him for covering up. But yeah, Silva got the stoppage in the third by rear naked choke. Quite enjoyed Park's guard play, actually. I thought he looked pretty active from the bottom. But I saw someone say, oh, as a Korean, it's really sad that all the Koreans in the UFC are washed. And I had to remind him, Do-Ho Choi, he came into the UFC as this phenomenon that everyone was raving about, and I wasn't very impressed because he was just a right hand across the top of the jab. And then he got sort of exposed, did his military service, came back, and in his last couple, he's looked like he's actually got a proper boxing game. He looks incredible. Beat the piss out of Nate Landwehr with beautiful lead hand uppercuts, which you don't see enough of. But yeah, that was the card. It was, well, depends what you like. There were a few finishes on it. But man, that middle period of the main card was rough. Luckily, next week, we've got UFC 321, which is okay, actually. Like, we do have Vinner Jandiroba versus Mackenzie Dern in a UFC title fight, which is insane. It is the heavyweight title in the actual title fight, which is, that's a shame. But we do have Umar Nurmagomedov versus Mario Batista, Volkov versus Almeida, Rakic versus Mirzakhanov, Haqparast versus Selkild, which I think is short notice, isn't it? Aliskerov versus Park. You know what? This is a good card, actually. Nathaniel Wood on the undercard. There's a man whose career was derailed by shit reffing. Anyway, I'm your boy Jack Slack. Sign up to Patreon to get all the extra stuff and enjoy more slacky content. And love one another. Cheers. Chito Vera trying to storm off after the decision was announced and trying to go out the wrong side of the octagon. Bless.